Imagine being forced to walk across a minefield while tanks roll behind you. No equipment, no support, just you and certain death. That was the reality for thousands of Soviet soldiers in World War II. But here's what most people don't know about these so-called punishment battalions. Some of these men became absolute legends. The Eastern Front of World War II was the bloodiest theater in human history. Over 27 million Soviets died. But within that massive death toll, there's a story that almost nobody talks about. A story about men who were sent to die, treated worse than criminals, and yet somehow some of them did the impossible. They survived, they fought, and a few even became heroes. Today, we're going to talk about the shtrafbats, the Soviet punishment battalions. These weren't regular soldiers. These were men who had been convicted of crimes, accused of cowardice, or simply pissed off the wrong commissar. And the Soviet military had a very specific use for them: human mine, detectors, cannon fodder, and suicide troops. This isn't some Hollywood story. This is real. This happened. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some historians call this one of the darkest chapters of the Second World War. Let's go back to 1942. The German Wehrmacht is crushing the Red Army. Soviet forces are retreating on every front. Stalingrad is about to become a meat grinder. Morale is collapsing. Soldiers are deserting. Officers are making mistakes. And Stalin is furious. So what does Stalin do? He issues Order number 227. You might know it by its unofficial name, Not One Step Back. This order changed everything. It made retreat a crime punishable by death. It created blocking detachments, Soviet soldiers whose job was to shoot their own comrades if they tried to run away. And it created the shtrafbats, the punishment battalions. Here's how it worked. If you were a Soviet officer and you retreated without permission, you got sent to a shtrafbat. If you were accused of cowardice, shtrafbat. If you criticized the Communist Party, shtrafbat. If you were late to your post, shtrafbat. Hell, there are records of men being sent to punishment battalions for telling jokes about Stalin. And once you were in a shtrafbat, your life expectancy wasn't measured in months or weeks. It was measured in days, sometimes hours. The average survival rate in a punishment battalion was about 3 months, but most men didn't last that long. Some died on their first mission. The Soviet command didn't see these men as soldiers. They saw them as tools, disposable tools. Let me paint you a picture of what life was like in a punishment battalion. You wake up in a trench somewhere on the Eastern Front. It's freezing. You're hungry. You haven't had a proper meal in days. Your uniform is torn. You don't have a helmet. Your rifle? It might work. It might jam. You don't know because you barely had time to check it. An officer walks up, not your officer. These guys don't care about you. He tells you that in 1 hour you're going to attack a German position. Your job? Walk across the open field and draw enemy fire so the regular troops can see where the German machine guns are hidden. You're not getting artillery support. You're not getting air support. You're barely getting ammunition. You are the support. You are the cannon fodder. And if you refuse, if you try to stay in the trench, the blocking detachment behind you will shoot you. They're not German. They're Soviet, your own people. And they have orders to kill anyone who doesn't attack. So you attack. You run across that field. You hear the machine guns open up. You see the man next to you get cut in half. Another man steps on a mine and disappears in a cloud of dirt and blood. You keep running because stopping means death. This was the daily reality for men in the shtrafbats. They were used for the most dangerous missions. Clearing minefields by walking through them, attacking fortified positions with no support, holding ground even when it was obviously suicide. The German soldiers called them Strafniki, and they knew that when punishment battalions attacked, it meant a major Soviet offensive was coming. The Strafbat men were the first wave. The expendable wave. One German soldier wrote in his diary, "Today we faced the Russians' punishment troops again. They come at us like zombies. No tactics, no fear, just wave after wave of men walking into our guns. It's horrifying, even for us." But here's the thing that nobody expected. Some of these men survived, and some of them became damn good soldiers. Let's talk about how this system actually worked, because it's even darker than you think. There were two types of punishment units in the Red Army: shtrafbats for officers and shtrafnieroti for enlisted men. Officers got sent to battalions. Regular soldiers got sent to companies. The idea was the same: redeem yourself through blood. If you survived 3 months, or if you were wounded in combat, you could be released back to a regular unit. Your crimes would be forgiven. You'd get your rank back. You'd be a normal soldier again. Sounds fair, right? 3 months and you're free. Except here's what they didn't tell you. The missions they sent punishment battalions on had casualty rates of 50 to 80%, sometimes higher. One attack could wipe out half the battalion in an hour. There are documented cases of punishment battalions being sent to attack the same German position 3 times in one day. Each time they got slaughtered. Each time the commanders sent them again. Why? Because dead men don't need food. Dead men don't need bullets. And there were always more prisoners to fill the ranks. The Soviet military kept detailed records, and we know that between 1942 and 1945, over 400,000 men served in punishment battalions. About 170,000 of them died. That's a death rate of over 40%. For comparison, the average death rate for regular Soviet infantry was around 15%, but the numbers don't tell the whole story. Because within this system of death and brutality, something unexpected happened. Some men found a way to not just survive, but to excel. This is where our story gets interesting, because among the thousands of men who were sent to die, a few became legends. Take Alexander Matrosov, for example. He was serving in a punishment battalion in February 1943. His unit was attacking a German bunker near Pskov. The bunker had a machine gun that was cutting down the Soviet advance. Men were dying by the dozen. Matrosov saw what was happening. He crawled up to the bunker, and then, according to Soviet reports, he threw himself on top of the machine gun embrasure, blocking it with his own body. His sacrifice allowed his unit to advance and take the position. Now, did this actually happen exactly like that? Historians argue about it. Some say it's propaganda. Others say multiple soldiers did similar things, that Day and Matrosov got the credit. But here's what we know for sure. This story became so famous that over 200 other Soviet soldiers were later credited with performing the same Matrosov feat during the war. The Soviet government turned Matrosov into a hero of the Soviet Union. They wrote books about him. They made movies. They named streets after him, all to show that even a man from a punishment battalion could redeem himself and become a hero. But Matrosov isn't the only one. There were others, men whose names we'll never know, but whose actions saved their comrades. There was a man, records only call him Sergeant Volkov, who was sent to a punishment company for retreating without orders. On his first mission, his company was ordered to clear a minefield. The usual way, by walking through it. Volkov watched 3 men get blown apart. Then he did something crazy. He started looking at where the mines were placed. He noticed a pattern. The Germans had planted them in a specific grid. So Volkov marked a safe path with sticks and pieces of cloth. He led his entire company through the minefield without losing another man. The commander was so impressed that Volkov was immediately transferred back to a regular unit and promoted. He survived the war. Stories like this happened more than you'd think. Men in punishment battalions had nothing to lose. They were already considered dead, so some of them took insane risks, and sometimes those risks paid off. Let's stop for a second and think about the psychology here. What kind of mindset do you need to survive when you're literally being used as human bait? Some men broke immediately. They'd freeze in combat, they'd refuse to move, and the blocking detachments would shoot them. That was that. Other men became reckless. They figured they were going to die anyway, so why not go out fighting? These were the guys who would charge machine gun nests alone or volunteer for the most dangerous missions. Some of them died, some of them became heroes. But there was a third group, the smart ones, the survivors. These men understood the game. They knew the Soviet command was using them. They knew their lives meant nothing to the generals, but they also knew that if they could survive long enough, they might get out. These men learned to fight smart. They'd study the terrain. They'd watch the German patterns. They'd find ways to complete their missions with the fewest casualties. And when they got the chance, they'd do something spectacular to get noticed. One former shtrafbat soldier, I'll call him Victor because his real name isn't in the records, told his story to a Soviet journalist in the 1970s. He said, "We weren't brave. We were practical. Bravery is when you have a choice. We didn't have a choice, so we found ways to stay alive. We helped each other. We shared information. We learned the German tactics better than the regular troops because we fought them every single day." Victor survived his punishment battalion. He was wounded twice. The second wound got him sent back to a regular unit. He ended the war as a lieutenant. After the war, he never talked about his time in the Strafbat. He was ashamed, but he was also proud, because he survived. Here's something that pisses me off. After the war, the Soviet government tried to erase the punishment battalions from history. They didn't want people to know about the Strafbats. Why? Because it made the Red Army look bad. It made Stalin look bad. How do you celebrate the great patriotic war when you have to admit that your own military was sending thousands of men to their deaths as punishment? So they buried the records. They changed the statistics. They stopped talking about it. Soldiers who served in punishment battalions were told not to mention it. If you had been in a Strafbat, that went on your permanent record. You couldn't get certain jobs. You couldn't join the Communist Party. You were marked for life. Some men lied and said they'd served in regular units. Others just stayed quiet, and slowly the stories faded. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that historians started digging into the archives and finding the truth. They found the orders. They found the records. They found the names of hundreds of thousands of men who had been erased from history. And they found stories. Oh man, did they find stories. There was a pilot named Ivan Plotnikov. He was shot down behind enemy lines in 1942. He made his way back to Soviet lines. But when he arrived, he was accused of being a German spy. Why? Because he survived when he should have died. They sent him to a punishment battalion. This guy was a trained pilot, and they made him a foot soldier in a suicide unit. Plotnikov didn't complain. He fought. On one mission, he personally destroyed 3 German machine gun nests. He captured a German officer and brought him back for interrogation. He was wounded 4 times in 6 weeks. Finally, a Soviet general noticed him and asked what the hell a pilot was doing in a punishment battalion. When he found out, he immediately had Plotnikov transferred out and restored to his rank. Plotnikov went on to fly 87 more combat missions and survived the war. How many other stories like this are lost? How many men died in punishment battalions who could have been heroes in regular units? We'll never know. Okay, let's be honest about something. Not everyone in the punishment battalions was innocent. Not everyone was a hero. Some men were sent there for actual crimes, murder, assault, theft. These weren't Boy Scouts. The Soviet military didn't just fill the Strafbats with officers who made tactical mistakes. They also used them as dumping grounds for criminals, deserters, and anyone they wanted to get rid of. There are records of men in punishment battalions who had been convicted of rape, murder and other serious crimes. The Soviet command figured, why waste a bullet? Send them to the front. Maybe they'll kill some Germans before they die. This created a really messed up dynamic. You had innocent men who'd been wrongly accused fighting alongside actual criminals. You had communist true believers next to guys who hated Stalin. You had officers who'd made one mistake serving under men who had no business being in the military. And the treatment of these men was brutal. I'm not exaggerating. Brutal. They got the worst food, the worst equipment, the worst quarters. Regular soldiers would sometimes spit on them. Officers treated them like dirt. Even other prisoners looked down on shtrafbat men because being sent to a punishment battalion meant you were lower than low. There are accounts of punishment battalion soldiers being forced to sleep outside in winter while regular troops stayed in heated buildings. There are accounts of them being denied medical treatment for wounds. There are accounts of them being shot for minor infractions that would get a regular soldier a verbal warning. One Soviet officer wrote in his memoirs, "I once saw a man from a punishment company shot for stealing a piece of bread. The same day, I saw a regular soldier steal an entire case of rations and nobody said a word." The message was clear. You are not one of us. You are already dead. You just don't know it yet. Let's talk numbers for a minute, because the scale of this is hard to understand. Between 1942 and 1945, the Soviet military formed 65 punishment battalions and 1,048 punishment companies. That's over 1,000 separate units of men being sent to die. The average punishment battalion had about 800 men. The average punishment company had about 150 men. Do the math. That's roughly 209,000 men in punishment battalions and another 157,000 in punishment companies, over 366,000 men total. And remember, this was a rotating system. Men came in, men died, new men replaced them. So the total number of men who served in these units at some point was much higher. Estimates put it at over 400,000 men. Of those 400,000, about 170,000 died in combat. Another 80,000 were wounded. Only about 150,000 completed their sentences and were released back to regular units. Think about that. Out of 400,000 men, only 150,000 made it out alive and intact. That's a survival rate of 37.5%. For comparison, the overall Soviet military had a casualty rate of about 30% during the war. Punishment battalions were worse, significantly worse. But here's where it gets even darker. Those casualty numbers only count men who died or were wounded in combat. They don't count men who were executed by blocking detachments. They don't count men who disappeared. They don't count men who were worked to death or died from disease and exposure. Some historians estimate that if you include all causes of death, the real death rate for punishment battalions was closer to 60%. 60%. Imagine walking into a room with 10 people and knowing that 6 of them will be dead in 3 months. That was life in a shtrafbat. Let me give you some specific examples of battles where punishment battalions were used. This will help you understand just how bad it was. Battle of Stalingrad, September 1942. The Germans are pushing into the city. Soviet forces are being pushed back to the Volga River. There's no more room to retreat. Stalin issues Order 227, not one step back. Punishment battalions are formed immediately. One of them, Shtrafbat 1001, is ordered to hold a factory district against a German armoured assault. They have no anti-tank weapons, no air support, no artillery, just rifles and a few machine guns. The Germans attack with tanks and infantry. The punishment battalion holds for 6 hours. By the end, 400 of the 800 men are dead. The rest are wounded. But they held the position long enough for regular Soviet troops to move up and establish a defensive line. The commander of Shtrafbat 1001 was killed in the fighting. The second in command was killed. The third in command took over and was wounded. A sergeant finished the battle in command. Of the 400 survivors, 180 were released from the punishment battalion due to their wounds. The rest were sent back into combat 2 days later. Another example, the siege of Leningrad, winter of 1943. The Soviet military is trying to break the siege. They need to cross the Neva River and establish a bridgehead. The problem? The Germans have the entire river covered with machine guns and artillery. Solution? Send punishment battalions first. 3 punishment companies were ordered to cross the frozen river at night and establish positions on the other side. The ice was thin. The Germans were watching, and the punishment companies had no support. They crossed at 2 a.m. The Germans heard them and opened fire. Machine guns, mortars, artillery. The ice broke in places and men fell into the freezing water. Those who made it across had to fight without ammunition resupply for 6 hours until regular troops could cross. Of the 450 men who started the crossing, 89 made it to morning. That's an 80% casualty rate in one night. But here's the thing, they held that bridgehead, and that bridgehead became the launching point for the operation that broke the siege of Leningrad. Did the Soviet command thank them? No. The survivors were told they'd served 2 weeks of their sentence and were sent back to their units. Most of them died in the next offensive. Here's something most people don't know. There were women in punishment battalions, not many, maybe a few hundred out of the 400,000 total. But they existed. Most of them were political prisoners, women who had been accused of spreading anti-Soviet propaganda or who had relatives who had been arrested. Some were military nurses or doctors who had been accused of failing to save important patients. One woman, whose name is recorded only as Klavdia N in the archives, was a military nurse. She was accused of letting a Soviet colonel die because she treated a German prisoner's wounds first. In reality, the Germans' wounds were more urgent, but that didn't matter to the NKVD. She was sent to a punishment battalion, not as a nurse, as a regular soldier. She was given a rifle and sent into combat. Klavdia survived 3 weeks. Then her unit was sent to clear a village. She was shot in the leg during the assault. When the battle was over, she treated her own wound and then spent the next 4 hours treating wounded soldiers, both Soviet and German. A political officer saw this and reported her for showing sympathy to the enemy. She was pulled out of the line and court-martialed again. This time, they were going to execute her. But something unexpected happened. The soldiers in her unit, these hardened punishment battalion soldiers, refused. They said if the political officer tried to execute Klavdia, they would shoot him. The political officer backed down. Klavdia was released from the punishment battalion and sent back to service as a nurse. She survived the war and worked as a doctor in Kiev until she died in 1989. There aren't many stories like Klavdia's because most women in punishment units didn't survive, and most of their stories were never recorded. But now let me tell you about the moment when punishment battalions actually changed the course of a battle. The moment when these disposable soldiers proved they were anything but. July 1943. The Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history. The Germans are launching Operation Citadel, their last major offensive on the Eastern Front. If they succeed, they can split the Soviet forces and turn the tide of the war. The Soviet command knows the Germans are coming. They've built massive defensive lines, trenches, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, but they need more men, more soldiers to hold the line. So they bring in the punishment battalions, 7 of them, about 5,600 men total. These men are placed in the most vulnerable positions, the places where Soviet command expects the German breakthrough to happen. They're given basic weapons and told to hold, no matter what. The German attack begins on July 5th. Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, Ferdinand tank destroyers, wave after wave of German armor supported by infantry and airstrikes, the punishment battalions hold. For 3 days, these men, criminals, cowards, political prisoners, officers who'd made mistakes, hold their positions against the most powerful military force on the planet. They don't have anti-tank weapons, so they improvise. They tie grenades together and throw them under tanks. They climb onto moving tanks and drop explosives into the hatches. They dig trenches and let the tanks pass over them, then shoot the infantry following behind. One punishment company, Company 243, held a single hill for 14 hours against 6 German assaults. They started with 147 men. By the end, 19 were still alive, but they held that hill. The Germans couldn't understand it. How were these Soviet troops, clearly not elite units, clearly poorly equipped, fighting so hard? How were they not breaking? A captured German officer later said, "We were told we would face punishment troops, criminals forced to fight. We expected them to surrender or run. Instead, they fought like demons. We lost 3 tanks to 1 small group of men who refused to die." By July 8th, the German offensive had stalled. The punishment battalions had bought the Soviet command enough time to move reserves into position. The Battle of Kursk would become the turning point of the Eastern Front. Of the 5,600 punishment battalion soldiers who fought at Kursk, fewer than 1,200 survived the first week. But their sacrifice mattered. It genuinely mattered. And here's the crazy part. After the battle, the Soviet High Command recognized what these men had done. Over 300 punishment battalion soldiers were awarded medals. Dozens were immediately released and promoted. One man, a former captain named Pyotr Gavrilov, had been sent to a punishment battalion for retreating during a German assault in 1942. At Kursk, he personally destroyed 4 German tanks using improvised explosives and a stolen Panzerfaust. He was released, promoted to major, and given command of a regular rifle company. He survived the war and later wrote, "We were told we were criminals. We were told we were worthless. But at Kursk, we showed them who we really were. We were Soviet soldiers, and we would die before we let the fascists pass." This was the moment when the punishment battalions stopped being just cannon fodder and became something more, something respected, but the Soviet government still wouldn't talk about them. As the war progressed and the Soviets started winning, the use of punishment battalions changed. In 1943 and 1944, fewer men were being sent to shtrafbats. Why? Because the Soviet military was winning. Morale was up. Soldiers weren't deserting as much, and honestly, the Red Army needed every experienced soldier it could get. They couldn't afford to waste trained men by throwing them into suicide missions. By 1945, most punishment battalions had been disbanded or merged into regular units. The men who had survived were quietly reassigned. Some got their ranks back, others stayed as enlisted men, but were transferred to combat units. But the stigma remained. If you had served in a punishment battalion, it followed you. Even if you'd been released and promoted, people knew. Your record showed it. And in the Soviet Union, your record was everything. After the war ended, many former shtrafbat soldiers tried to hide their service. They claimed they'd been in regular units. They destroyed photos. They didn't talk about it. Because admitting you'd been in a punishment battalion meant admitting you'd been convicted of something. Even if you were innocent, the stain remained. One veteran interviewed in 1998 said, "I fought from Moscow to Berlin. I was wounded 4 times. I have 3 medals. But none of that matters. When people find out I spent 6 weeks in a punishment battalion in 1942, they look at me differently. Like I'm a criminal. Like I'm not a real veteran." The Soviet government didn't help. In fact, they made it worse. In the 1960s and 70s, when the Soviet Union was celebrating its victory in the Great Patriotic War, punishment battalions were never mentioned. Not in films, not in books, not in memorials. The official narrative was that the Red Army was a heroic force of volunteers who fought bravely for the motherland. Punishment battalions didn't fit that narrative, so they were erased. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that Russian historians started publishing the real story. And even then, it was controversial. Some Russians didn't want to hear it. They wanted to believe in the heroic narrative. They didn't want to admit that their grandfather's generation had used men as human minesweepers. But the truth came out anyway. The archives were opened, the documents were published, and slowly people started to understand what really happened. Today, in Russia, there are small memorials to punishment battalion soldiers. Not many, and not prominent, but they exist. In 2004, a monument was erected in Moscow to the soldiers of the shtrafbats who gave their lives for the motherland. It's a simple stone monument in a small park. Most people walk past it without knowing what it is, but for the few surviving veterans of punishment battalions, it means everything. There's a documentary from 2007 where an elderly man, he must have been in his 80s, stands in front of that monument and cries. The interviewer asks him why he's crying. He says, "I thought nobody remembered. I thought we were forgotten. I served in a punishment company for 2 months in 1943. I was 19 years old. I saw things that still haunt me. I did things I'm not proud of. But I fought. I bled for my country. And for 60 years, nobody acknowledged it. Now there's this stone. It's just a stone. But it says we mattered." That's powerful. In recent years, Russian historians have published more detailed accounts of punishment battalions. They've found letters, diaries, personal accounts, and the picture that emerges is complicated. Yes, the system was brutal. Yes, it was unfair. Yes, thousands of men died who shouldn't have. But also, yes, some of those men became heroes. Yes, they fought with courage. Yes, they helped win the war. Both things can be true. The punishment battalions can be both a war crime and a story of human resilience. So what do we learn from this? First, war is never clean. It's never simple. The Soviet Union was fighting for its survival against Nazi Germany. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and in that context, the Soviet command made brutal decisions. Were punishment battalions effective? Militarily, yes. They achieved their objectives. They held positions, they absorbed casualties, they bought time for the regular army. Were they moral? Hell no. Using men as human shields, sending them on suicide missions, shooting them if they retreat, that's not okay, no matter the circumstances. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. If you were a Soviet general in 1942 and the Germans were about to overrun your position and you had 800 punishment battalion soldiers available, would you use them? If using them meant saving 2,000 regular soldiers, would you do it? If it meant holding a critical position and preventing a German breakthrough, would you do it? I honestly don't know. And I'm glad I never had to make that choice. What I do know is that the men in those punishment battalions, whether they were there fairly or unfairly, showed incredible courage. They fought when they didn't have to. They died for a country that had condemned them, and many of them never got credit for it before. We wrap this up. I want to address something. Were the Soviets the only ones who did this? No, they were just the most extreme. The German military had Strafbataillon, punishment battalions as well. They were used similarly to Soviet shtrafbats, though generally not quite as harshly. German punishment soldiers were sent to dangerous missions, but they usually got basic equipment and support. The British and Americans had disciplinary battalions, but these were mostly for labor and rear echelon work. They didn't use them as frontline cannon fodder. The Japanese used penal units in China and the Pacific, but again, not on the scale or with the brutality of the Soviets. So why were the Soviets different? Part of it was ideology. The Soviet system saw human life as expendable in service of the state. Stalin famously said, "One death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic." Part of it was desperation. In 1942, the Soviet Union was losing. They needed bodies, lots of bodies, and punishment battalions were a way to get them. And part of it was cruelty. Let's be honest, the system was designed to be cruel, to punish, to break men, and it succeeded. So here's where we end up. Soviet punishment battalions were one of the darkest chapters of World War II. Over 400,000 men served in them. About half died. They were used as human minesweepers, cannon fodder, and suicide troops. But within that darkness, there were moments of light. Men who found courage when they had every reason to give up. Men who saved their comrades. Men who fought not because they had to, but because they refused to die as criminals. Alexander Matrosov throwing himself on a machine gun. Sergeant Volkov mapping safe paths through minefields. Pyotr Gavrilov destroying tanks with improvised weapons. Klavdia the nurse treating wounded soldiers under fire. These people existed. They fought, they bled, and for decades nobody talked about them. Now we know, and we remember. The punishment battalions were a crime, but the men who served in them were not all criminals. Many were victims, and some were heroes. Hit subscribe if you want more history that schools don't teach.